Israel will take its supporters wherever it finds them today, and it tends to find them amongst crazy people like the evangelical Christians of America, the Millets and the Bolsonaros of the world. It'll find them amongst Narendra Modis of the world. When it comes to something like the genocide in Gaza, there are certain relationships that you cannot maintain anymore. I would not be having this conversation at the BBC or CNN.
One critic may ask you, well, Pankaj, 2008, that was 17 years ago. Why wait till 2025 to have a book like this?
India makes a lot of noises about anti-colonialism or anti-imperialism, but unfortunately, it is now seen by a large part of the world's population as standing with the imperialists. I think it's an extremely naive expectation. When people talk about speaking truth to power, what they don't realize is the power already knows the truth. It's not interested in listening to it at all.
In his latest book, the acclaimed Indian author and historian Pankaj Mishra reckons with Israel's war on Gaza, as well as the moral and geopolitical ramifications of Israel's onslaught. Most notably, he grapples and poses the question of, what does the world look like after Gaza? In his book, Mishra places Gaza within the larger context of Western colonialism, but other themes he deals with include the Holocaust, its weaponization, and the post-war global order created in its aftermath. So, today we'll be unpacking several topics, most importantly ones that relate to how the world has responded to Gaza, also complicity, decolonization, and white supremacy. Pankaj Mishra, thank you so much for taking the time to be on Real Talk. I appreciate you coming here.
Thank you, Mohamed.
Pankaj, at the time we're filming this, Israel has broken its ceasefire agreement. It's resumed its bombardment of Gaza, killing at least 430 Palestinians, including 174 children. When you see moments like these on the ground, and you think about the reason why you wrote this book, The World After Gaza, what is it that comes to mind?
Well, I think the world is definitely a much bleaker place than, even what I imagined while I was writing this book. I did expect the Israelis to continue this war of mass extermination. I expected Donald Trump to win and for him to give the green light to Netanyahu. I expected Netanyahu to, continue to wage war in order to preserve his hold on power in Israel. But at the same time, I think, when you're confronted with the videos, with those images of dozens and dozens of dead children killed in a single hour by the Israeli Defense Force, you still are shocked, appalled, demoralized, plunged into despair, and again forced to ask yourself, what is this hell that we are being asked to inhabit today, and probably for the foreseeable future.
And you've said that Netanyahu is someone that's actually working against the interests of the Jewish population in the world, not just inside Israel. But I want to hear you expand on this, and also if we can draw ties from Israeli leaders like Netanyahu and Menachem Begin, for example.
One of the earliest critics of Israel, many of them in fact, and I quote many of them in my book.
Yes.
These were people who were arguing that the way Israel is developing into essentially a country run by far-rightists, by ethno-nationalists, by majoritarian demagogues, they would be achieving a kind of victory that even Hitler could not achieve, which is to establish permanent antagonism between not only the state of Israel and the rest of the world's population, but also, most damagingly, between the Jewish population worldwide and the rest of humanity. And I think with Netanyahu, we're seeing this happen in real time. The damage he's doing not only to the reputation of the state of Israel, the damage he's doing to social relations between Jewish populations around the world and other populations, the way in which he has appropriated this sort of cause of defending Jews worldwide, the ways in which he has conflated the defense of Israel with the defense of Jews everywhere, which are profoundly anti-Semitic conflations. This is really, I mean, it's terrifying to me, because you can see very clearly the consequences of this kind of conflation. People blaming Jews worldwide for what the state of Israel is doing. You will remember people blaming Muslims for what bin Laden was doing at one point, and we know the consequences of that. So I think the exponential increase of both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia today, which have, sort of sometimes linked causes, is something that we really have to be extremely alert to, and especially when it comes to, people like Netanyahu, their supporters in Europe and America. This kind of, claim that they are constantly making, that we are here to defend Jews worldwide, is one of the most dangerous things you can say at this point.
And if we delve into your book, Pankaj, you one of the themes that you deal with is the Holocaust and its aftermath. And this notion that struck me is the further that we move away from the historical context of the Holocaust, the more ideological it becomes. And I just kind of wanted to understand this more from you, this notion.
Well, that is interesting, isn't it? That
it is.
The further you get away from the actual event, the source of suffering and trauma, the more intent later generations become. Now, why is that? I mean, that's a question I seek to answer at great length in this book, which is to show how collective memory is something very deliberately constructed. Individual memory is something that springs out of a certain experience, which an individual, obviously bears within himself or herself, occasionally transmits it to the second generation or third generation, and the memory weakens gradually, as it is passed through generations. Collective memory, when it is organized by a state or by the institutions of the state, is something meant to be permanent. It's meant to be used for political and ideological purposes. And that's how the memory of the Holocaust was used by the State of Israel. When the first survivors of the Holocaust arrived in Israel, again something I describe in this book, they were treated with great contempt by the then leaders of Israel.
Including Ben Gurion.
They were seen as weak, helpless people, and people who were not fit material for the construction of a strong Zionist nation state. It was only in the 1960s that the Holocaust became something that could be commemorated, that could be talked about as a great sort of national narrative of the state of Israel. Before that, there was a kind of avoidance of the subject. This is something that's reminding us of weakness. There was very little scholarly attention paid to it. There was very little public commemoration of it. In the 1960s, the Holocaust starts to become central to Israeli national existence. At the same time that Israel becomes the strongest military power in the Middle East, able to simultaneously take on various Arab countries and defeat them, acquires a nuclear capability. And at the same time, the state on the whole starts to enter, this kind of state of paranoia that a second Holocaust could happen any moment. The people surrounding us, the Palestinians or other Arab populations, there are potential Nazis amongst these populations who are hell-bent upon exterminating us. So you see how the narrative of the Holocaust turns into this narrative that actively serves Israeli expansionism. So you have Moshe Dayan saying that, the borders of Israel are the borders of Auschwitz after 1967. So, in other words, Israel has to keep expanding in order to avoid another Auschwitz. This is the logic of this particular Holocaust narrative today. So a kind of crazed survivalist mentality that makes you commit the most extreme atrocities also helps you justify them by referring to something that happened in the 1940s and by telling people that this could happen to you again. So if you don't expand, if you don't keep beating up the population in the West Bank and Gaza, you will be exterminated. So these are the distorted forms that this particular narrative has taken over the decades. And now you see, the kind of monstrous culmination. In a single day of bombing, you kill, more than 150 children.
And I was just going to ask you that. Does it lower the bar, this narrative, does it lower the bar when it comes to justifying Israeli violence?
Of course it does. I think when you present yourself as existentially besieged, when you present yourself as a people or a nation state surrounded by totally uncompromising enemies who are hell-bent upon exterminating you, then every kind of response, every kind of extremity, atrocity becomes justifiable.
And how have you seen the weaponization of the Holocaust being invoked since October 7th? That's something that you've got into
I think,
your book as well.
you see this in just the political rhetoric that is coming out of Jerusalem, in the rhetoric of political leaders. You see this in the yellow star worn by Israeli diplomats at the United Nations. You see this in the references to Anne Frank. I think this is the biggest narrative strategy that the State of Israel and its propagandists have today, which is to constantly invoke this in order to continue occupying the moral high ground. In every other way, they manage to expel themselves from that moral high ground. This is the only claim that they still have to it.
One of the figures that you talk about in the book, Jewish figures, is Primo Levi. And he's a Holocaust survivor and a Jewish writer and thinker. He was very much against the narrative of victimhood. And I think in his later essays before his death, he was really questioning the narrative of complicity, or the idea of complicity. How does his writings and his experience play out in terms of what we're witnessing today?
Mohamed, he's a big influence on this book,
yes,
and generally on my thinking about these issues, because I think it's interesting to go into his biography a little bit.
Sure.
Italian Jew, deported to Auschwitz in 1944, comes out of it in 1945, barely alive, goes back to Italy through this, very kind of meandering journey he takes across, Eastern Europe, parts of the Soviet Union, and then back to Italy. Describes it in two books, which I strongly recommend to everyone. And then, from 1970s, 1980s onwards, starts to re-examine his experience. The first experience he's describing is primarily of victimhood. How can it be otherwise? Here he is completely exposed to these Nazi brutes in Auschwitz, along with thousands of other people. But then, as he grows older, he also realizes that this particular narrative of victimhood is being instrumentalized, it's being weaponized, and also at the same time simplified enormously. So his protest is both intellectual and political. When it comes to Israel, he can see very clearly that Israel is starting to exploit this narrative a great deal. And this all comes to a head in 1982 when Israel invades Lebanon, as you know, supervises the massacre, the infamous massacre of the refugee camps in Lebanon. And
which Reagan called a Holocaust.
Which Ronald Reagan himself described the Israeli assault and the killing of children particularly, which moved him enormously as a Holocaust. And Primo Levi is one of those people, many actually Jewish intellectuals and writers, who are extremely, extremely distressed by this development. They've already seen from afar and been really appalled by Israel's descent into ethno-nationalism, but this event in particular really comes as as a sort of really shocking proof to them that something truly horrific has happened. So he starts talking about, he's on a visit to Auschwitz when he hears about these atrocities in Lebanon, and he immediately organizes a petition. He demonstrates in front of the Israeli embassy in Italy, and becomes, again, a much more sort of outspoken critic of Israel, along with other Israeli intellectuals. Then he goes to America and he comes into contact with the sort of cult of the survivor that has become, for many people, an extremely commercial proposition. And he's really appalled by it. The way surviving the Holocaust has been turned into a kind of industry in the United States. One embodiment of that that he's kind of very dismayed by is Elie Wiesel, who for many people is like the kind of embodiment of the survivor, who's a kind of, for many people, the sort of main source of information about the death camps. And Primo Levi really is extremely uneasy about this cult of celebrity and the cult of consumption that has grown around the figure of Elie Wiesel. So, in this career, and then, towards the end of his life, he writes this book, The Drowned and the Saved, where he examines this question of victimhood and wonders whether survivors themselves have offered too simplified an account, and that perhaps survivors should not be trusted, that the people who were true witnesses to the Holocaust were all killed during the Holocaust. So all kinds of questions that he starts to raise before he kills himself, And he kills himself partly because there are people in America attacking him for not being Jewish enough. I mean, the grotesque irony of Primo Levi being described as not Jewish enough. Why was he described as not Jewish enough? Because he wasn't a great supporter of the state of Israel towards the end of his life. He was a very strong critic, in fact.
And how are you seeing this come back today, if you are seeing this come back today? This notion of calling someone not Jewish enough for being anti-Zionist or for being critical of Israelis' actions.
Well, you see that happening in Germany, where Jewish critics of Israel are the people most brutally victimized and attacked by the German police when they demonstrate. There's so many videos out there. I'm sure you've seen those of actually, in a couple of instances, Holocaust survivors, being attacked. Because for many people, I think, this sort of idea that there are Jewish critics of Israel, that is more troubling to them than, say, people like myself being critical of the state of Israel. Because they are conflating, again, as I keep insisting, in the most anti-Semitic way, Jewishness with Zionism, Jewishness with the state of Israel.
I'm going to read you a quote from the book. Quote, "For years now, some of the most fervent upholders of the memory of the Shoah and defenders of Israel are also Europe's and America's most authoritarian and often anti-Semitic politicians, movements, and personalities." Now, I've had Jewish American guests on the show who've made very much a similar point to this, but I do want to ask you about how you see this contradiction of having anti-Semitic figures that are also defenders of Israel.
I think you will see a contradiction only if you think that Jewishness is synonymous with Israel, or that Jewishness means that you have to constantly support Israel. I think if you think that Israel actually represents something else, not so much the Jewish experience or Jewish history, or if you don't see that is as a culmination of Jewish history, if you see Israel as an ethno-nationalist state with far-right politics, with structures, hierarchies of racial discrimination, why would you not be excited by it if you're a far-right ethno-nationalist in Europe today or in America today? If you're going after immigrants, you're going after Muslims, you're going after minorities, why would Israel not be a source of inspiration for you? We're not thinking here, these people are not thinking anymore about Israel as a sort of place where a Jewish population is in a majority. They're thinking of it as a place where the far-rightists can do the kind of things they themselves would love to do in their own countries. So I think the attachment to Israel on the part of anti-Semites, once you take out the Jewish question here, then you will see why the anti-Semites are so attracted to the state of Israel. You will also see then why the Israeli government, there was a piece in Haaretz two days ago, why the Israeli government is so intent upon creating these alliances between some of the most notorious anti-Semites in Europe today. I think we have to separate these questions from, this sort of longer history of Jewish persecution and questions of anti-Semitism, and stop seeing contradictions here. We should focus on ideological, emotional, psychological affinities between people who are ruthlessly despotic in the state of Israel today and people elsewhere who want to be more like the people in Israel today.
And why do you think the Israeli government is welcoming of these alliances?
Simply because I think these are now the people who are the strongest supporters of the state of Israel today. Liberal Democrats, people who believe in the coexistence of peoples, societies, nation states, civilizations, these are not people who can be sympathetic to a far-right ethno-nationalist project like Israel. So Israel will take its supporters wherever it finds them today, and it tends to find them amongst crazy people like the evangelical Christians of America. It will find them amongst the Millets and the Bolsonaros of the world. It will find them amongst Narendra Modis of the world. That is where the strongest support is to be found.
I'm going to get into media coverage right now of Gaza and the recurring question of media complicity, and I'm specifically talking about legacy media or mainstream media organizations. In your book, you say the New York Times editors instructed their staff in an internal memo to avoid the terms refugee camps, occupied territory, and ethnic cleansing. Now, how do you see this kind of, let's say, editorial control in the larger picture of Western media's coverage of Gaza?
I think, Mohammed, it's very easy to be shocked by the way institutions like the New York Times, the Atlantic, the BBC, the various others who've disgraced themselves in the last 15 months or so, disgraced themselves quite conspicuously. But I think it's also important to see the longer histories of the way in which these institutions, these media institutions, have covered the rest of the world. When you look at the way the New York Times was describing the Japanese in the 1940s and comparing them to monkeys swinging from trees, setting the stage really for the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By that stage, the Japanese had been so systematically dehumanized by the American press. So this dehumanization by the media of people that the United States or Western Europe or the West in general wants to exterminate, that kind of preparation by the media has been going on for extremely long time. So I think even the Gaza episode has to be put into the context of the media lying through its teeth about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Again, creating the stage, setting the stage for mass destruction and calamity in the Middle East. There are so many other examples come to mind. You can go back further to the way, the Indian independence movement was covered, the way in which the British press covered large parts of the world in the past. So I think we have to look at all this in the context of a longer history and see that this particular regime of suppression, evasion, censorship, it's something that's profoundly institutionalized within these outfits. Their claims to liberalism, their claims to being open-minded, their claims to be protecting human rights have to be assessed, again, in the context of these longer histories of outright propaganda.
You use the word disgraceful. Would you call it also a type or a kind of bankruptcy, like a moral or intellectual bankruptcy?
I would use those words, but again, with the qualification that this is not something new. Right. This is something that's been going on for a long time. I would even say that calling it bankruptcy or calling it, it's almost like saying this is an aberration. I would say that this kind of a coverage is very much a constitutive element of the way they look at the world. In other words, this is not something that at this point is showing you that they've actually messed up, on this occasion, or they messed up in the Iraq War, or they messed up, in some other war during the Vietnam War. This is something that's been going on for a long time. This is part of the way these institutions have seen the world, the way they have recorded the world. So this is something we have to become extremely alert to today, instead of focusing on individual instances.
And how have you been looking at your place with these institutions, in terms of writing with them, being interviewed by them, dealing with them, and because that's what, you've built a career on that for the last, let's say 2 decades or so. So how has Gaza right now made you look back on your place within in these institutions in legacy media?
I think a lot of us who worked within these institutions know that they've actually, in many ways, always been up against it. At various levels, at various contexts, various moments, you've been engaged in a process of deep contestation, argument. So these careers that you talk about, long careers, which seem from the outside successful, materially rewarded, these are careers actually marked by great friction, ideological, emotional friction, anxiety, distress, where you've had to deal with editors who want you to say certain things in your narrative, and then you have to push back and say, no, I'm not going to do this. Sometimes you have to pull your article, take it elsewhere. So this process of negotiation, which is hidden from most people, I think at some stage it's all going to come out. We're going to look at a secret history, or let's say a history of censorship. And I think we will learn more about the experiences of people like myself who've had to deal with, these sort of mainstream periodicals and mainstream institutions. But I think today it's become very clear that, when it comes to something like the genocide in Gaza, there are certain relationships that you cannot maintain anymore, that you have to be very clear about where you stand. And if that means...
Can you talk to me more about that?
Well, I think, if you are going to remain a person with a conscience, then you've got to reconsider many of your alliances and professional relationships today. Or you stay within those institutions and become dead inside. That's something I would say to a lot of people I know, who I know are in this position. Really, the choice before them is, do you stay and continue to do what you're doing, or do you leave and take enormous risks, of course, completely expose yourself, to the sort of wild world that we are living in today, without source of income, without any kind of stable employment. These are big decisions, but I think many of us are faced with those decisions today.
And for ones that and I'm sure many that work in these institutions, let's say conversations behind closed doors, do they come for you, do they come for advice? Maybe they share similar stances to yours, but they just can't leave. I mean, what do you tell them?
Well, it's very difficult to tell them that, you have to act according to your conviction, according to your principles. These people may have children, these people may have families that they are supporting. It's not easy for them to just, get up one fine day and leave. I'm in a position where I can make these kinds of, renunciations or kind of not do the kind of things that I don't want to do. But many people are not. So, you have to take that into account, obviously. But at the same time, it's an intolerable situation that many of us have been put into by this regime of lurid mendacity that so much of the mainstream media has been operating.
On your personal journey, you write this: I grew up thinking of the Israeli military heroes that we should be emulating in India. And you also spoke about having a picture of Moshe Dayan on your wall, who is the former Israeli defense minister. Now, how did this vision, this reverence for Israel, for you develop?
Well, it's actually really easy to understand, Mohammed, if you look at, for instance, the biggest fan base of Netanyahu today, which is in India. So the people who support Modi are also the biggest supporters of Modi, and because India has such a large population, so even a small fraction of people who are supporting Modi will constitute the largest fan base of Netanyahu. And what is that attraction built upon? It's again that same sort of attraction that the far rightists in Europe and America have, where here is a country that knows how to deal with Muslims in the language that the Muslims understand, which is more force, more force. When I was young, that was the main source of attraction that many people felt around myself to Israel, which is that here we are, misguidedly secular, state which pampers its Muslim minorities, which doesn't realize that you have to be really strong, tough, ruthless, hyper-masculine in dealing with these treacherous enemies within. And Israel was an example of how to deal with these internal and external enemies, and it was an example of how to create a strong, cohesive nation state. So I think this is something that many people grew up with, and today those people happen to be ruling the country, who have kind of enormous power and influence, and can actually also tilt India's foreign policy in a kind of direction that favors the state of Israel today.
I'm going to come back to your 2008 visit to Israel-Palestine in a second, but since you mentioned India, I'd like to ask just a couple questions on that, because India's often been seen as having been pro-Palestine in the past. That's obviously changed in recent decades, especially now under the Modi government, as you mentioned. And also the rooting ideologies in both countries, Zionism and Hindutva, they share strong connections, specifically regarding Kashmir, where both the secular and the nationalist views align on the occupation. Now, given this, how do you make sense of India's image as a democratic, nonviolent country when it actually shares these parallels with Israel?
I think India's actually suffered a catastrophic loss of image and reputation and prestige that it enjoyed for a very long time. For decades and decades, I think India was seen as a leader of the countries of Asia and Africa. Soon after decolonization, you had enormously eloquent and principled people who were in charge of India's foreign policy. Even when they had to make compromises, I think they were able to present those compromises, in a way that was persuasive, that was even appealing to many people. So I think that position has been completely abandoned by the current government, which wants to be seen and wants to be close to the United States, and also therefore to the allies of the United States. I think it's now realizing, obviously, especially since Trump came to power, that is probably not a wise strategy, because Trump is such a transactional president. He doesn't really believe in alliances. He certainly doesn't believe in permanent alliances. And that within 2 weeks' time, he's going to impose some crippling tariffs on India. So India's got to come up with some good answers to this, find some other, country that it can more kind of at least trade with on the same kind of terms that it has enjoyed so far. So these are dilemmas that have now, in a way, come to haunt this current government, because again it decided that it could break from its sort of older tradition, not just of being pro-Palestinian, but also being kind of more kind of responsive to other global South countries, speaking on their behalf on international platforms. I think all of that was kind of set aside for the sake of a fantasy that India was now a superpower that had arrived, and its future lay in aligning itself closely to United States, especially in this sort of alliance that the United States was creating against China. I think we'll find that a lot of those expectations, a lot of those kinds of fantasies are going to be exploded very soon.
But what about its military ties to Israel as well? I mean, over the past 16 months since the war in Gaza started, India has refused to call an arms embargo on Israel. It's continued its arms exports to Israel. It's the largest purchaser of Israeli weapons. Just recent reporting by Middle East Eye revealed that an AI weapon system used by Israeli ground forces in Gaza was co-produced by an Indian company. Now, I think, I know you've said this before in another interview where you say that basically in relation to Gaza, India has played its cards badly. But would you not also argue that it is complicit in what's happening right now in Gaza?
It is like many other governments, that have been selling arms to the state of Israel. No, it's a serious, profound and devastating, moral lapse on the part of the government of India. If there was, if this government was more accountable, if the opposition in India was stronger, they would question this government more aggressively than they have. Like, what is it doing right now? You have on one hand South Africa or a country like Brazil assuming the leadership of Asia and Africa, not just, kind of in economic terms, but most importantly in moral terms. South Africa is the moral leader today of, the global South, for want of a better word, because of the principled stand it has taken vis-a-vis Gaza. Going to The Hague with this case of genocide against the state of Israel was a huge risk. And obviously they're being punished severely by the United States right now. The ambassador was just expelled from Washington, D.C. the other day. Is going to pay a huge price for doing this. But I think, it basically stayed close to its foundational impulse that we cannot accept racist imperialism anymore. India makes a lot of noises about anti-colonialism or anti-imperialism, but unfortunately, it is now seen by a large part of the world's population as standing with the imperialists.
Let me go back to your 2008 visit to Israel-Palestine. You wrote this: "For months after my trip to Israel in 2008, I lived with a strange disturbance unlike any I had known after visiting other atrocity sites." And then you go on to say, "The Palestinians under occupation stood so far apart from their persecutors, and I found it unnerving, too, that their persecutors were the West's former victims who now possess the ease and safety of a Western lifestyle on both sides of the wall, dividing Israel from the West Bank." Now, why was this such a turning point for you? And this is something that Ta-Nehisi Coates has also talked about in his book, The Message. It's going from a place where you had this infatuation or reverence for Israel to actually seeing and realizing the reality that the Palestinians face in terms of occupation and everything else. But why was it a turning point?
I think, nothing really actually prepares you just for the sheer hideousness of the structures of occupation in the West Bank. The way in which those structures have been devised, there's something truly fiendish about them, So that comes as a huge shock because, none of the books you've read, none of the films you've seen, none of the documentaries really actually prepare you for this revelation for a place like Hebron, for instance. And also sort of casual abuse. We are now witness over the last 15 months to acts of spectacular violence, that Israel has inflicted on both the West Bank and Gaza. But there is a kind of everyday structural casual violence. And that's something you can only see once you're there. So that was a sort of huge, in a way, shock to many of us who went on that trip. The other thing I would say is that if you go to Israel, having grown up in a post-colonial country, with the narrative of national independence, which is, what is that narrative? The narrative is that the world was divided up by white supremacists into the North and South. The white supremacists exploited these countries mercilessly, ruined their societies, ruined their economies, and people from these societies had to wage a very long battle to get rid of these exploiters from Europe and to send them back to their respective countries. And some of the best people in our countries fought to end racial privilege, fought to end white privilege. If you grow up with that narrative, and then you go to State of Israel and see white racial privilege being so brutally enforced in structures of apartheid in that country, you cannot but be shocked. This is perhaps not a experience that a European will have because that European has grown up with a very different narrative, that European has grown up with the narrative of the Holocaust, that person will see Israel, as I used to, I still do in many ways, as a country that had to be created in order to house the refugees of the Holocaust. But when I go there and I see the occupation, I'm appalled because I see something that is going on in 2025 that should have stopped in the 1940s, which is Palestine should have been decolonized a long time ago.
One critic may ask you, well, Pankaj, 2008, that was 17 years ago. Why wait till 2025 to have a book like this?
Well, Mohammed, that's really interesting because I've wanted to write about this issue for a very long time, from the late 90s onwards. And I faced constant discouragement. I think, again, going back to your earlier question.
Sure.
Like, what are the media regimes that we all have to inhabit? If you're a writer from India, you're allocated certain subjects that you should really write about. Occasionally, you'll break out of this little ghetto and attempt something riskier. Those attempts might be accommodated. So if you say, I want to write about China, yes, you can write about China. So I did write about China. China is safer to write about because China is a supposedly enemy country. So whatever you write, obviously it'll be critical of what's going on there in China, and that will be, welcomed. Writing about Israel, of course, puts you in a very delicate territory with editors in the West, because you are going to be critical, obviously, and that criticism is not really truly acceptable coming from people like myself. It's best expressed by American writers or European writers, but I think that's one reason why we haven't had Arab voices in the Western media for a long time. One reason we don't have Palestinian voices is because that kind of criticism is too devastating, it's too upsetting. So to answer your question, I've tried to write about this subject on numerous occasions, but always discouraged. And there are instances I discuss in the book too, where people just said, I lack credentials, or this is not something we are interested in, although they would commission someone else to write about it. Again, this forms part of a longer history of censorship, of suppression, of propaganda that one day should be written, so we can actually confront the truth about the Western media's coverage of this subject, the extent to which they've lied, they've obfuscated, tried to obscure the clearest, the most visible realities of the occupation and of structural modes of violence. So I wrote about this issue in 2024 when I was asked by the London Review to deliver a lecture, and I thought to myself immediately that I'm going to write about this subject. Here was an opportunity to express many of the things that I'd wanted to express, also bring into play a whole range of my interests and concerns, not just in Jewish history or European intellectual history, but also the intellectual history of places like India, of China. So there's a lot in this book that actually emerges out of long-standing interests and concerns, and it is brought into conversation with this particular subject of Israel.
One point, Pankaj, that you write in the book, which I found interesting, and I wanted to bring it up. You write, Hegel had sneered at Jews as much as he did at Asians and Africans while elaborating his philosophy of universal development. Now, these are the philosophers that we studied in university, and in my case, at least, there wasn't that much focus on how much their thinking was rooted in white supremacy. And it's not just Hegel, it's Locke, it's John Stuart Mill. But I just wanted to kind of talk about this point with you.
It's interesting because I've been writing about this subject for a very long time. But I think in this book, what I try to do is to describe how the European population, the European Jewish population, was described, how it was treated by other Europeans. And I think that experience connects the Jewish experience to the experiences of colonized peoples. So if Hegel is saying, neither Jews nor Africans nor Asians have, much of a history, really, because they're not particularly creative people, or they haven't really done enough to make history. This was a kind of broad view of the kind of innate incapacity of colonized peoples, of Jewish peoples, to come up to the levels of civilization created by sort of white Christian Europeans. So I wanted to look at these experiences and bring them into conversation with each other. Again, we are too accustomed to now seeing Jews as part of this undifferentiated sort of mass of the white population of Europe. You have to remember that for a very long time, and especially intensely since the late 19th century, Jews were viciously persecuted and stigmatized and ostracized by the European population. They were often described and denounced in the same terms that colonized peoples were described and denounced, as weak, cowardly, unmanly, parasites, breeding too much. All of these things which are familiar to us when they're applied to Muslims or natives in India, people who ought to be exterminated. This kind of rhetoric was directed at Jews for a very long time. So what I'm trying to do in this book is to bring those experiences into conversation, so that for young people, they can start to see the Jewish populations of the world as part of their history, instead of seeing them as part of a Western history. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
I think as long as you keep looking at the Jewish population or the state of Israel as part of this history of the West, I think you're going to be missing a lot of things, and you're certainly probably going to be also helping this very dangerous process that I describe, this conflation of Jewishness with the state of Israel.
And another point is how a point that is probably taken out, maybe not mentioned enough or taken out of context, is how European crimes against the Jewish people actually relate to what we're seeing unfold today. Exactly.
And also the European crimes against Jews, they have a longer history too. That's also really important to understand. And those links to 19th century imperialism, to imperialist practices, whether of the concentration camp, there's so many things that Hannah Arendt, for instance, talks about in the first volume of The Origins of Totalitarianism. Whole rhetoric of racial dehumanization, how that was perfected in the colonies and then directed against Jews in Europe. So I think it's really also important to understand those links between the monstrous violence of the Holocaust and the many Holocausts inflicted on colonized peoples in different parts of the world. So again, this modern history of violence is not something that can be divvied up into these, parochial narratives of victimhood. We have to see this as a larger whole. This history is indivisible. It cannot really, if you try and divide it up, you're basically an ideologue or a demagogue who wants to use a history of violence and suffering as a justification for your own violence and expansionism, which is what the state of Israel is doing right now.
And I think that is also why you've made decolonization a central theme to the book, basically.
Yeah.
Moving on, again, we're actually going back to what I was asking you about, how you deal with legacy media and institutions. What do you feel like the struggle ahead for you as a writer in the West? I mean, is it censorship? Why can't we just be having these conversations without, you being you as in any writer who writes about it, being subjected to cancellation, being subjected to labels, being subjected to attacks? Why can't we just be having these conversations without all of these factors?
I think we can only have these conversations if we build institutional settings for them. Here I am having this conversation with you in an institutional setting that makes this conversation possible. I would not be having this conversation at the BBC or CNN. So my role as a writer at this point is not to keep producing these books or articles, not only to keep doing that. Hopefully I will continue to do some of that, but I think my task is to now create platforms or help create platforms, help build institutions where experiences, perspectives that have been disregarded for a long time, not just disregarded, but actively suppressed for a long time by the mainstream Western media. Those experiences and perspectives come into the light. And these experiences and perspectives are of the vast majority of the human population. You have to remember, Europe and America constitute a fraction of the human population. So I think if you don't have platforms and institutions that foreground those majority experiences and perspectives, we will remain at the mercy of these institutions that actually reflect the experiences and perspectives of only a minority, and yet remain hegemonic because of a lack of challenge, because of a lack of alternative institutions. So unless you build those alternative institutions, nothing is going to change. You're going to remain vulnerable to the pressures emanating from the owners of these media institutions. You're going to remain helpless before them. You're going to watch them do propaganda day in and day out. You will watch 400 people being killed in a single day, and you will watch the media come up with all kinds of formulas to defend and justify that. That will continue to go on unless you build alternative institutions.
And adding on to that, do you think your writing will have an impact on those in power?
I don't expect to, have an impact on people who are in power right now. I've never have actually had that. I think it's an extremely naive expectation. When people talk about speaking truth to power, what they don't realize is the power already knows the truth. It's not interested in listening to it at all. So you should aim what you want to say to the people who might be in power in 20 years' time. You should aim, in other words, to people who are still young, who are still, in a way, able to receive what you're saying, to absorb it, to actually assess it. Not people who are already ideologically, intellectually, completely formed and fixed in their ways, also fixed in their careers. Career advancement, social promotion, social ambition, they play a huge role in the way power remains indifferent to truth. You know the truth, but you don't want to hear it because hearing it might endanger your career prospects. So I think it's best to write for people, it's best to appeal to people who are not so invested professionally in maintaining these regimes of falsehood and mendacity.
And, as our conversation comes to a close, I just want to read you one more quote from your book. Most recently, in Donald Trump's electoral triumph, Israel will most likely succeed in ethnic cleansing Gaza and the West Bank as well. There's already too much evidence that the arc of the moral universe does not bend towards justice. Powerful men have always made their massacres seem necessary and righteous. Firstly, before I ask you my second last question, what did you mean by that Martin Luther King quote, that the arc does not bend towards justice?
I think, it's nice to be able to think that it does bend to justice. It's a luxury enjoyed by people who score certain victories, small victories, and can tell themselves, yes, we've succeeded. It's not a luxury that is available to people currently facing a genocidal onslaught. For them to think, or for them to be expected to think, that the arc of the moral arc of the universe bends to justice would be, on our part, something obscene, I think. So, I feel like these kinds of truisms, these kinds of sort of slogans, it's almost become a slogan, really need to be assessed in their particular historical context, and these cannot be sort of something that you put on a t-shirt. We have to really look at the situation and see a people that are being systematically exterminated. There can be no talk of the moral arc in this context. What we have to acknowledge right now is the rule of brute force, the rule of extreme violence, the rise of brutal regimes in the United States, in Israel, in some parts of Europe. And I think having a lucid view on all this is much, much more important at this point than deluding oneself, with these kinds of slogans.
But, that paints quite a grim picture, doesn't it? And so where do we really go from here? I mean, is there hope, or is that even not supposed to be the thing that we're looking for right now?
I think hope really only should arise once you have truthfully reckoned with what you call a grim situation. Once you've really fully acknowledged it, that's when the resources for hope also start to become clearer. And again, in this context, like, what is hope? Hope is that there are people who are protesting against this right now. People who are paying the price for protesting against it, people who are being kidnapped and taken to some unknown location, people who are being dismissed, people who are having their degrees revoked. I'm speaking here of young protesters in the United States and also elsewhere, who are taking enormous risk at the time. That is hope for me. These are people who have actually looked at this hell and realized they don't want any part of it, and are starting to act. These are people still very young. 10, 15 years time, they will be in some positions of power and influence, hopefully. Hopefully some memory of this event, some memory of this calamity will survive and make them more principled, more compassionate people. That is hope.
And on that note, The World After Gaza, that is the book to get and read. Pankaj Mishra, thank you so much for taking the time to come on Real Talk. I really appreciated this conversation.
Thank you, Mohamed. Thank you.